Welcome to episode 8. Yes, 8. We've got that far. It's already episode 8. We're on episode 8 of the podcast, which means there's 2, maybe 3 more to go. Now, with some of these episodes, there is like a bonus episode. So we do a bit of a chat, and then there's the full-on here's what you missed episode, which is the case here. So in this episode you're about to watch, episode 8, we have a conversation. I'm having a conversation with Dr. Mark Fox, who is an expert. He's done studies and everything on near-death experiences, and it makes for a fascinating conversation. And a lot of the stuff we talk about, I keep saying, I don't want to preempt your talk, I don't want to preempt your talk. Of course we preempted his talk, because everything overlaps, and you couldn't help but get into the subject. So here is the conversation I had with Dr. Mark Fox a few weeks before he came into this chat. And if you're interested in that, you found that interesting, then sniff around the playlists and you'll see the full talk from the evening. It's not as good quality because we had to record it like on a camera, on a wobbly stool, on the top of a cupboard. Anyway, it's very complicated. You don't have to worry about that, the technicalities. But this was made for a fascinating conversation with Mark Fox discussing the phenomenon that is now known as near-death experience. Well, hello.
Hello.
Thanks for agreeing to be involved with the Death and Glory season. That is good. We're looking forward to the conversations we've had and are going to have. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Mark Fox, and I've been researching near-death experiences for what seems like forever. I became aware of them first back in the mid to late 70s, just after Raymond Moody coined the term near-death experience in his seminal 1975 study, Life After Life. I read a serialization of this, first of all, in a newspaper, and then a somewhat more detailed serialization in, I think, the Reader's Digest. And by this point, I was about 14, and I bought Life After Life, which was Raymond Moody's first book, where the term near-death experience first occurred. And my interest has continued since then, really.
So was it not identified as a thing before his book then?
Good question. They never called them near-death experiences before Moody's 1975 book. They were written about. There certainly was a kind of corpus of popular literature which included these return from death accounts, which had consistent motifs, such as an out-of-body experience, or going through an episode of darkness, or seeing a light. There was a discrete category of experience that had been isolated with those consistent features, and you'd see certain books including either chapters on it or whole books on it, but they were never called near-death experiences until Moody coined that phrase.
So did he kind of pull the whole? Because often there's this how things work, isn't there? There's things happening, but no one sees them as there's some coherence here, and they put it all together. Is that what he did then? Do you think he managed?
He did, really.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, he did 2 things. Number one, he produced something called the Moody model. So we got about 100 and 120 cases of near-death experiences, and he picked out the common features, made a list of them, but then added a plot to that list and turned it into a kind of paradigmatic narrative, which he called the near-death experience. And that became, for better or worse, massively influential. So that was the first thing he did, and they call that the Moody model. And I think in its original form, until he got rid of a few of the elements in his later books, it had 15 elements, which he had culled from about 120 accounts. and that became the kind of template, really.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to preempt your talk. Are you going to be saying all this at the talk?
There's so much I could say in the
Oh,
talk.
okay.
I don't think we could really talk about near-death experiences without talking about the Moody model.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It will be a bit like talking about Jesus without mentioning John's gospel.
Yeah.
It's kind of integral to the whole thing. I mean, you could, but you'd be lacking something if you did.
Yeah. It is interesting that it does seem to be. I don't know whether that's just picking it up from predominantly from popular culture, whether it seems to be such a coherent, consistent thing. The other question I have, sort of, I guess, based on it, is a bit like the because this all links into this kind of area, the alien stuff. When the big-eyed alien image became popular, everyone saw aliens that looked like that, didn't they? Because that's what aliens look like. So whenever people claim to have seen aliens, that's the alien they saw. So is there an element, do you think, of people read it, they go, oh, that's that, and then that's so that affects or I'm not saying they make it up, but it influences what they experience, having been told this is what you experience.
Yeah, I mean, how curious. I should happen to have on my desk here a copy of a book that compares near-death experiences with UFO encounters. Uh, you couldn't make
Spooky.
this up. Spooky. And in this book that was written in 1987, the author, Kenneth Ring, who was the second major near-death experience researcher after
Hmm.
Raymond Moody, writes about the similarities between near-death experiences and UFO encounters. And it's rather interesting that his paradigmatic alien in this 1987 book is indeed a grey with big eyes and
Yeah.
slits for a nose and a kind of small horizontal line for a mouth. So I think, yeah, he is dealing with the kind of culturally dominant image of the alien that existed in America in the late 1980s. So I think there is some truth in that, actually, that he's been influenced, actually, in this book, in his own words, by a chap called Whitley Strieber, who wrote a book called
Yeah.
Communion, which kind of popularized that. I remember going to church in the late 80s, and there was a bus stop outside. And on the side of that bus stop, like they used to, there was a big advertisement. And it was a big advertisement for Whitley Strieber's book on alien abduction, Communion. And it had that absolutely archetypal image of the
Yeah.
elongated grey face with the big eyes, etc. And I think that did become quite a dominant image
Yeah. I
from the
mean,
late 80s onwards.
yeah, what's partly interesting is how things do influence how we see stuff, don't we? It's a bit like the way our memory works, isn't it? Because you remember something, and the next time you remember it, if I understand the science right, is your brain basically rewrites the memory, and so we do rewrite stuff, and when we and things, so things presumably influence our memory of stuff, and there's no reason why it can't influence our actual experience. I don't think there's any reason why not. So in a sense, it doesn't make an experience less real. It's more about our interpretation of it, isn't it, that gets adjusted.
Yeah. And I think these things are culturally and geographically specific. If you look at the UFO literature in the early copies of Flying Saucer Review back in the 1960s or even late 50s, in South America, when they were reporting alien encounters, it was kind of little hairy dwarfs.
Right.
So the notion of the grey with the big eyes did not exist, say, in Brazil in the late 50s or early 60s. They were kind of these hairy monsters, really.
That is fascinating. I mean, just the flying saucer itself, that became a cultural icon, didn't it, for alien spaceships?
Yeah.
So it's yeah.
Can I tell you a fascinating story about that?
Please
At
do.
the risk of going off topic. The flying saucer, we actually know who coined the term flying saucer. It was a journalist whose surname was Beckett, whose Christian name escapes me for the moment. And what happened was there was this kind of foundational sighting on, I think, the 24th of June 1947 by a chap called Kenneth Arnold, who observed a kind of V-shaped formation of strange craft in the vicinity of Mount Rainier in the States, when he was trying in his plane flying overhead to locate a crashed US Air Force cargo plane. When he landed, this went to the news very, very quickly, and he described the motion of these objects as like saucers skipping across water. The motion. Right. Beckett picked up on that description and substituted shape for motion and said, oh, flying saucers. And ever since then, people reported saucer-shaped objects. But when you go back to what Arnold originally said, when he used saucer, he wasn't describing shape, he was describing motion.
Anyway, to get back to the plot.
Sorry.
Obviously, I mean, there is overlap in, because these are the edges of human experience, aren't they? And they're encounters that lots of people have. All this kind of UFOs, near death, ghosts, all that stuff. Although in one sense they're very different, as we've already picked up, there's lots of threads, isn't it, that draw them together. I'm fascinated by the link. Not that I want to go off on another topic at this point, but I'm fascinated by the link between fairies and aliens and the similarities there are there. And I know it's human for us to draw connections, isn't it, and see faces and things. That's a human thing. But it is fascinating how all these kind of edgy experiences that humans have lots of links, lots of connecting threads and images and feelings, don't they? It's fascinating. So anyway, so why near death? Because you have a broad interest in this kind of paranormal stuff. Why did you kind of I don't know if this is your field of expertise, your only field of expertise. Why near death experiences? What was it about that particularly?
Originally,
because
when I first came across this literature, I just got to the point when I realized that I was going to die. It was kind of the first time I became a philosopher, because up to when you're in your early teenage years, death is what happens to other people. And then you get to a certain age and you realize, no, actually death happens to me. So you then kind of get launched into a kind of existential quandary, particularly if you didn't grow up with any kind of religious faith. And I didn't. I grew up in Great Bar in Birmingham, which was about as spiritually bereft as you can get. And suddenly Moody's book came along just as I was waking up to my own mortality and everything that implied. And Moody was saying, hey, look at this, all these accounts, and they're not just dreams, because they have this striking consistency. And these people are anyway saying they weren't dreams, they were realer than dreams. And when he starts to provide this model and these narratives, which certainly suggested to me strongly that death wasn't the end, it was the first ever solution to my existential quandary. I'm going to die. What then? Moody comes along and says, oh, this then.
There's another chapter.
So that's how I got interested in it. You see, it was a purely subjective thing. But hand in hand with that also was the fact that I've just always been interested in this anomalous stuff. And I don't know why. It's just always been with me.
I think it is. We are fascinated by it because, I mean, I would like to regard myself as quite rational and scientific. But there is a fascination about this, about something else, whether there is something else going on the edges of our experience, something. And the science parallel, probably someone who knows more about this would be able to correct me and say, of course, that you got that completely wrong. Just the concept of alternative dimensions now that science says there is, kind of makes you think, well, that might be what we're talking about here. I mean, I believe in God. I think there's a faith element to it. I don't think God is just another alien who's more powerful than us. I think it's a different type of being. But the idea of other dimensions, and that somehow or other in life, and then we interpret them according to our culture and the time period. But there's times when this existence kind of rubs against another one, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah.
So yeah, the near-death stuff is, and I guess all of us have questions about what's next and what we're going to do. And
Yeah.
you've kind of answered my next question, really, which is, what questions does this raise or answer? I mean, have you answered that one? I don't know.
I mean, I guess the first one it raises is this proof of life after death?
Hmm.
And if you accept the plural of anecdote as data, and you think that this actually is good data, then you're probably going to read books like Moody's book and come away with the conclusion, wow, science, because it resuscitates more and more people, because it's getting smarter and smarter, is opening more and more windows into the afterlife, and is showing us a kind of common picture. So
Yeah.
therefore there must be life after death. That's one thing that people take away from this body of research. And
Okay.
so I guess that is one question that it might answer. What happens when we die? Answer this: tunnels, lights, encounters with deceased relatives, a being of light, a beautiful transcendent realm.
So do you think that is that people, in a nutshell, are not wanting to preempt your main talk? Do you think that does say this is what the afterlife's like? People have a glimpse of heaven, whatever it might be. Do people come back and say, I saw hell? I don't know. Is there this sort of, they've actually seen it, or have they had an experience pre, whatever it might be?
Okay, some people
Angels?
do have what they call negative near-death experiences, which
Yeah.
is that they kind of don't have a pleasant experience.
Right.
Overwhelmingly in the literature, we have positive experiences reported. In fact, in some of the books, they only ever talk about positive experiences.
Right.
Moody's first book, for example. So it may be the case that the overwhelming majority of near-death experiences are positive, or it may well be that people who have negative ones, hellish ones, don't want to talk about it because it might reflect on how they live their lives.
Yeah, because I was wondering about how you do a character assessment on all the people that have had this experience.
Yeah, yeah. Or thirdly, it might simply be that the reason why we have far more books on positive than negative experiences is because publishers don't really want to sell a book called I
Yeah.
Went to Hell, because it won't sell for, who wants to read that? The world's bad enough as it is.
I don't know. I think culture at this point, people might like that kind of stuff.
They'd much rather read things like, my eternity in the light or something like
Yeah,
this, rather than my descent into darkness.
that's true. I guess when you look at the I use the word, and I use the word very loosely, community of people that are interested in the afterlife, particularly ones that aren't particularly faith based. It is very pastel shades. Everything's rose. It's all fields and butterflies, isn't it? There is a kind of, I don't wish to sound critical, but it's a very sentimental view of heaven. We sit on a cloud and everything's great and warm and cozy, isn't there? And particularly, I think people who don't follow a faith, that's their kind of vision. Heaven's just a nice day out in the country kind of thing. And I don't know, it sounds a bit dull to me.
Yeah. And this brings me to my next point, really, which is a lot of these afterlife scenarios do sound to me a bit dull as well. It's
Yeah.
almost like the kind of thing you would expect. In fact, it is paralleled within spiritualist literature, stuff
Right.
that people get from mediums. Well, I mean, I've never trusted that as far as I could throw it. So why would I trust NDE literature anymore? Do you know what I mean? So that's
Yeah.
an issue. The other issue, of course, a while ago during the lockdowns, I wrote an article for the Quaker Journal on what C.S. Lewis might have made of near-death experiences. Now, he didn't write about something called a near-death experience. Of course, he couldn't have done because the term didn't exist while he was alive. But he kind of did make reference to something along the lines of mysticism in a book that he wrote, a late book on prayer, Letters to Malcolm. I don't know whether you've ever heard of that. And
I
he
haven't read. I know of it, but yeah, I haven't read it.
it's a very interesting book, and he was kind of talking about experiences, it seems to me, where people leave this life, and he came up with a very interesting phrase in there. He said, well, departures are all alike, it's the landfall that crowns the voyage.
Hmm.
And what I think he was trying to say was, when a person has an experience like a near-death experience, they're describing departure from this world. But
Right.
there's a world of difference between what happens when you leave somewhere and what happens when you arrive somewhere else. And I'm just wondering if that's what's happening with near-death experiences, that we're being given this massive literature about what it's like to die, but nothing about where we end up after that.
Right.
All about departure, but there's nothing about arrival.
Yeah. And that is interesting because, in a sense, that this, I guess, the topic of our this season is around death. I mean, we are doing death and glory, but the glory bit is one of the great unknowns, isn't it? We just don't know. So, in a sense, the near death stuff, that the person hasn't died, so we still don't really know.
No, we
They've had,
don't.
they've had an experience, and a bit like we'll be talking about ghosts at one point. You know, that conversation, are these people coming back? Because if they do, they don't tell us anything. Like it's like this or it's like that. Even the ghost sort of phenomena um, is appears to be fixed in this existence, doesn't it?
Yeah,
They're not going, well, it's like this when you die, and every, it's a very strange in between, isn't it? Because they're not here,
yeah,
but they're not somewhere else. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I suppose that's where faith does come in, doesn't it? Whether that's in a god, a specific god, or in a general another level of existence, isn't it? It's that
Yeah.
belief. So do you, from so to kind of start wrapping it up, I guess. What are your? I mean, do you have any feelings or views of your own about either death or glory as your kind of work and research, because you have done a lot of work in and around this field? How does that affect you as an individual? It's all very well saying here's a load of theories and here's the research. How does it made you feel about the whole area of death and the possibility of afterlife? What's your take on it now?
When I first read it, I was persuaded that maybe these things are telling us that there is life after death and what it's like afterwards. All these years on, I'm not at all as sure as I was.
That's because you get older, the less you know. Don't
The older you get, the less you know, and I guess the more you reflect on what you thought you did know.
Yes.
And um, there's a fundamental incompatibility, it seems to me, between what we Christians hope for and what is being shown to us in near-death experiences. One big area, of course, is resurrection.
Yeah.
Um, as I think it was Oscar Kuhlman who once wrote, "There's no need for Easter if we're all immortal." And the message of Easter is that God keeps faith with the dead. He keeps faith with the dead to the extent that after they're dead, he plucks, as it were, them out of the grave, um, gives them a new body, stands them up again, which is what resurrection means in the Greek, and that's the life beyond death that we're by faith hoping for. It's one that is wholly dependent on the grace of God, and one which is fundamentally bodily, and not in any sense to do with the disembodied soul continuing in some other realm.
Yeah.
Now, I've come to the conclusion as a Christian that there is a fundamental incompatibility between the information disclosed in near-death experiences and that which is disclosed in Scripture. And any day of the week, I would rather put my hope in a God who keeps faith with the dead than with this body of testimonies which we find in this literature.
How interesting. Yeah. Well, we could go off on a whole new line there. I mean, which we will briefly, if you got time. I
Yeah,
mean, the idea that actually, yeah, we're not immortal, we're not eternal beings, but resurrection is something that God does.
totally.
It's a life that's given.
Just like
So
this one.
yes, in a sense that at the moment, society and particularly Christianity, as it appears from where I sit in the West, is very much, it's heaven and hell, and particularly the loud, shouty wing of the church is that there's eternal torment or eternal, bliss. I don't really see that in scripture. I can see where it's come from, but I don't see that as a conclusive. And the idea that actually God will bring back some people, but not everyone, actually has an equal weight in terms of scripture, I think. So the near death is, it sounds like, and perhaps we'll hear more of this when we have the full talk from it, is a journey to whatever's going to happen. So perhaps some people reach the end of that corridor and drop off the edge, and that's it. And other people, catch a train to whatever the next level is. I don't know. Perhaps that's where it goes. I don't know why I'm telling you what to think. You're the expert on this.
Well, the NDEs most of the time are overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah.
And it would be a very paranoid conclusion, I think, for anybody to draw that having had such a blissful experience, they then kind of go through a final door and they end up in eternal torment. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
You can't rule it out, but it doesn't sound quite right. So if we might see the NDE as the kind of foothills of resurrection almost, a kind of foretaste of the glory that is to be, that would at least have a kind of more pleasing consistency to it.
Yeah. I guess it's just one of these things that one day we'll find out. Or not.
Yeah, or not. Of course, we'll never not find out.
Yes. Anyway, I really appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
So yeah, thanks for that. And we look forward to the talk with you. So
Thank
that's Dr. Mark Fox. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Take care now.
And you.